Howdy my totally as always tubular gamers, and we're back with, you guessed it, another ranking video. And today we're going to be looking at a fighting game series. We're going to be looking at the Samurai Shodown series of games. Now, for the uninitiated, Samurai Shodown, known in Japan as Samurai Spirits, is a fighting game series developed and published by SNK. The series began all the way back in 1993, and it's known for being one of the earliest in the genre, with a primary focus on weapon-based combat. At the time, weapons in a fighting game really hadn't been seen. We had games like Street Fighter and Fatal Fury. People weren't out here attacking each other with swords, and here comes in Samurai Shodown, taking place way earlier in Japanese history, where we got samurais going at each other, we got ninjas, we got tons of crazy people with all these awesome looking weapons. And then on top of that, this game was incredibly violent, and it was actually really challenging. This game was not messing around with its weapons. You could totally slash up your opponent. You could even cut him in half in some of the later games. It got pretty violent for the time, and the game wasn't messing around with its difficulty either. This is not a button mashing series. A lot of people really gravitated towards it because of how methodical and just kind of slow it is. Your attacks do a shit ton of damage to each other. And it's not rare at all where a match will only have like 8 or 9 hits to it. Seriously, this game is all about punishing, countering, blocking, and perfectly attacking. And it's thanks to all of this that Samurai Shodown has really become a cult classic fighting game series that's still even around to this day. The latest release was on modern consoles. They revived it a couple of years ago. And so here I am today. I thought I was going to rank all of them. And so here I am today. We're going to rank all of the Samurai Shodown games from worst to best. We're going to be looking at, just everything, how they age, difficulty, controls, how much fun I've had with it, etc. Now, Samurai Shodown has had a ton of games over the past, and not all of them have reached America. In fact, a number of them have not. I will not be looking at the games that have not been released in North America. I also want to put it out there, I'm not a fighting game aficionado. I don't know all the ins and outs and strategies and competitive play for all of these games. I'm a pretty casual player. I just play these games with my friends for fun. My word is certainly not law, and this is just my opinion, and if I mess something up, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, we'd really be here all day. I'm also only going to be looking at one version of each game. I know plenty of these games have multiple versions, particularly Samurai Shodown 5. We're only going to be looking at one version, and it's what is considered the, quote, definitive version. If I'm wrong, you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let me know your favorite down below. Maybe one day this list will be outdated and we'll get another one. Like, share, sub, all that good stuff. Let's just get right into it. What is the weakest of the Samurai Shodown games? So what I believe to be the weakest of the Samurai Shodown games is Samurai Shodown Sen, released in arcades and Xbox 360 of all consoles in 2009. And it was supposed to be a celebration of the series, I guess, but what we have is a 3D Sam Sho game that feels nothing like any of the other games, and it doesn't feel good on its own either. So when it comes to its characters, it has a decent enough roster with a bunch of familiar faces, but it does have a number of new characters as well. I don't really feel anything for this game's roster, though. I mean, it seems fine. For the fighting itself, it introduces a bunch of new movement mechanics, but those don't really matter all that much. With 2 slashes, a kick, and a grab, basically what you have here is an extremely simplistic 3D fighting game here. Everything you think you knew about special moves of these characters is pretty much gone. There really are no special moves like at all in this game. Any multi-hit combos are also automated in this game, which, it isn't the worst thing in a game that's like Marvel vs. Capcom or something, but this is Samurai Shodown, where it's supposed to be more methodical, slow, and punishing, so like, what even were they thinking? I guess they were trying to make the series more user-friendly and pick up and play, I guess, but it just doesn't work. This game feels so basic, even compared to the original couple games. It reminds me of like Soul Calibur, but like really low budget and bad without any personality. This is like one of the lamest fighting games I've played in forever, and I think the world has totally forgotten about this game for good reason. It is not worth playing. It's not even worth looking at. Like, what even was this game? It just totally blows. And so here we have Samurai Shodown Warrior's Rage for the PS1. Now this game, when it comes to its title, has a little bit of confusion. This is not Samurai Shodown 64 Warrior's Rage. This is a different game. It is only on the PS1, and English-speaking people now call it Warrior's Rage 2 to avoid confusion. Hopefully that clears things up. Doesn't really matter though, because this game is not very good. So this game came out when SNK was really trying to get onto the 3D bandwagon. It is the third 3D game released in the Sam Sho series, and it really just isn't too hot. The game takes place 20 years after the old 2D games, and I guess goes for a more Garu Mark of the Wolves vibe, but that game absolutely nailed it out of the park when it came to taking place way later and seeing all the young characters grown up. This game has all new characters minus Harumaru and Hanzo, and I'm sorry, but these new characters just do not do it for me. And I think this is like the worst roster in the entire series. Like, none of these new characters are interesting to me or really even reach out to me in any kind of good way. Now, despite being in 3D, this game really doesn't even feel like it. The most 3D movement you have is like a dodge, and that's really it. So what you have here is a very awkward, slow 3D fighter that plays really nothing like a Sam Sho game. It feels even slower than the main games and just wasn't even close to satisfying. It didn't have a good flow to it at all. It also has a new health bar system that is just unintuitive, and I don't like it. I just don't really like what this game is throwing down. I didn't have much fun with it at all. And to be honest, I was ready to put this game down just about as fast as I picked it up, because I was just like, this is just incredibly unenjoyable. The graphics look like ass also, even for the time, which really doesn't help things. Well, I mean, it's not as basic as Sen, it's still not an enjoyable time at all, and there's a reason most people even forgot the game exists, because it's not worth remembering. So here is Samurai Shodown 64 Warriors Rage, which is not on the Nintendo 64, but rather the Hyper Neo Geo 64, which is the only way to actually play this game, so unless you find it in the wild or you got a MAME booted up, you're not playing this game. But you're really not missing anything with this game either. This was the second 3D fighting game in the Samurai Shodown series, and this one just doesn't hit either. The game does try to have a narrative about the reincarnation of Yuga the Destroyer, but I just didn't really pay much attention to this one. When it came to the characters, it doesn't have anything all that special. I mean, it's got most of the classic characters here, and while it doesn't have all of them, I think the roster is pretty whatever. Unfortunately, when it comes to the gameplay, this is where I think that the game totally falls apart like Warriors Rage on PS1. I would say this game is slightly better, but I still wouldn't recommend either of them. This game feels very sluggish, it's slow, it's supposed to be 3D, but it certainly doesn't feel 3D at all. The game's flow is just all kinds of messed up, with matches going either really fast or really slow, and it just doesn't feel anywhere close to satisfying. I just was not having a good time with this game either. I was like, this is just a bad, seemingly early 3D fighter, and then I looked at when it was released and I was like, oh, this isn't an early 3D fighter. Why does it just kind of play like ass? It feels really nothing like the old Samurai Shodown games, and you know, you could go, oh, that's because it's 3D versus the 2D sprites, but I mean, I would think it would still feel pretty similar for the most part. This just doesn't play anything like the really good Samurai Shodown games, and with that in mind, I just can't really recommend it. Not that you really do have to go out of your way to try this game, and I just don't think that's worth doing at all. So here we have Samurai Shodown 64, not for the Nintendo 64, but for the Hyper Neo Geo 64, which is the only place that this game is ever released. So break out the MAMEs, break out Fightcade, that's the only way you're playing this game. Now, it's pretty clear at this point in the video that Samurai Shodown and 3D fighting just don't really go together. In fact, SNK and 3D fighting games don't really go together at all. With that said, Samurai Shodown 64, it's not as awful as the other games, and I actually do have a few things to say about it, unlike the other games which I put down pretty much immediately. Now, the first thing I want to say is that this game at least attempts to have the vibe and atmosphere of the 2D Sam Sho games. The other 3D games, I just don't even know what they were doing. This game at least tries to have that vibe and atmosphere, and I mean, it has some mild success with that. Graphically, for 97, I mean, it didn't look horrible, but it didn't exactly look very good either. It's just very blocky, and it has not aged well at all. The story is about Yuga the Destroyer, and he uses people as puppets to do his bidding and do, well, what his name implies. The story is pretty whatever, but that's to be expected with a game like this. When it comes to the character roster, it's got a lot of the favorites, plenty of characters you've seen before, but the game actually does introduce two new playable characters. It introduces Yagu, this huge dude with a giant metal arm, and then it actually was the game to introduce Shiki, who is a swordswoman who fights with dual katanas. She's actually been in a bunch of other SNK games, including the newest Samurai Shodown game. It's cool to see where she got her start, for sure. Now, as you would expect, the fighting does feel different from the 2D games. However, this game actually does make use of its 3D space much more than, say, Warriors Rage. You can move in any direction, and the stages are actually multi-tiered. You can even knock opponents through walls and floors into different sections of the same arena, and the game even has some ring outs. I'm not really big on this, but I mean, it exists. The fighting itself, it doesn't feel super sluggish. It actually has a decent flow to it and a decent pace. It's not, you know, great or even all that good, but it's a step better than Warriors Rage. Similar to the aesthetic, it at least attempts to have that Samurai Showdown feel, and it at least tries to have a similar flow to the 2D games. Obviously, I think all of the 2D games have a much better flow than this game, but again, it tries. The game has this really weird system that's the stamina bar, where it's to prevent you from moving all over the place, and it's got to recharge if you use it too much. There's even a POW meter, which gives you unlimited stamina, and you can do a super move. The actual movement and the actual fighting itself, like I said, it's kind of like the old games. Now, all of this coming together creates a half-decent fighting game. It's not awful, it's not unplayable, and it's not the worst 3D fighting game by SNK or even in this series, but I certainly still wouldn't recommend it. It's just a little too slow and clunky for my liking, but I mean, it's playable. And the fact that it was never released on a home console means you gotta go out of your way to play this, and I just don't think it's worth doing. Now, it might be a hot take to have it here on the list, but here I have Samurai Shodown 3 Blades of Blood, initially releasing in '95. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this game is that it has a much darker aesthetic when compared to Sam Sho 1 and 2. All of the characters really underwent a visual makeover to match this new tone. Any humor or lightheartedness that the first two games had is just totally gone here. It's gritty and dark. And while, you know, I love dark and gritty and edgy stuff, I don't know if this really matches Samurai Showdown. But I can say when it comes to the graphics, the game does look pretty great for the time, and it's a lot flashier than the first two games, and there's definitely some style here. Now, when it comes to the character roster, most of the characters return. There's a few that don't, but there are a few new characters here as well. I think the roster is fine enough. I know it's not giant or all that complex, but this is only the third game. Now, every character in this game actually has two different versions. They can use the slash or bust version. And each version really does have its own moves and fighting styles. Slash is much more like the first two games, while bust is a more aggressive style that introduces new moves. Thanks to this, every character has more moves than before, but I just don't really know how to feel about this slash and bust system. I feel like it's not implemented all that well. Maybe it's just me. I didn't really find all that much reason to use the burst move. I thought slash was just way better. So instead of 2 and 2, when it comes to your attacks, it's also slightly different. You now have 3 slash buttons and 1 kick, which is probably better. This game, it does feel a little bit smoother than the first two games. It doesn't feel as clunky, but I just didn't like this game anywhere near as much as the first two games. The game has wall bounces, which are pretty annoying, and this game is just not messing around. This is like the hardest game in the series. This game was just whooping my ass left and right, and so I just had to play multiplayer with my friends, and we just didn't really have as much fun with this game as we did with the first two games. It's hard for me to put my finger as to why we didn't enjoy it as much. There's probably a number of small reasons, but we just didn't, plain and simple. The game does have some good to it though. It's got some really cool looking clashes, a few fan favorite characters were introduced here, and it's got an interesting presentation. If you're gonna play it, you're probably playing all the other Sam Sho games, so you might as well try it, but it's not one of my favorites. And here we have maybe another hot take. Here we have Samurai Shodown 6 releasing initially in 2006. So this game doesn't really have much of a story. It's supposed to be more of a celebration of the Samurai Shodown series, and with that in mind, well, let's look at the roster for a second to go, holy crap, they have like every character from all of the Samurai Shodown games, at least all the 2D ones. They have like every character here. This is like the best roster maybe of the entire series. They really do have a lot of characters here. So with that in mind, why is this game not like at the top of the list? Well, you know, a great cast of characters doesn't mean all that much if I don't think the fighting is amazing. Otherwise, Street Fighter X Tekken would be like one of the best fighting games ever made. Shoot, there's even some new characters here like Aurora. They got a lot of characters here. But anyway, when it comes to the fighting, I just didn't really love how this game flowed. I didn't think it flowed all that well, and I think the biggest reason is because this game features a Spirit Select system, which is basically where they allow you to choose between 6 different fighting styles based on all the previous Samurai Shodown games. Yeah, 6 different fighting styles. When you're mixing and matching all these different fighting styles with so many characters, I just don't really know how it's going to flow all that well, and I think this game is a testament to actually being too much. There's too much going on here. Because of this, the flow, it's just not there. It doesn't feel as satisfying or as impactful as some of the old games. And yeah, we got every character you could have ever wanted to play as, but I feel like this isn't the best version of these characters. And the gameplay, it's actually pretty smooth. It's one of the smoother 2D games. It's just I don't know, man, it didn't hit right with this one. It just really didn't. And one of the reasons I think that this game didn't hit right is that there's no gore or really all that much violence at all, which Samurai Shodown has been known for the gore and violence since day one, and there's none here. There really is nothing here when it comes to the violence. And you're trying to tell me that these people are attacking each other with these weapons and there's not even a little blood? Come on now, that's pretty lame. And I think that's one of the reasons the game doesn't feel as satisfying. I might be in the minority here, and I know some people really do like Sam Sho 6, but I just didn't really connect with it, especially compared to some of the other games, despite the large character roster. But hey, you could do way worse with other Samurai Shodown games. This game is fine by those game standards. And so here we have the very forgotten Neo Geo Pocket Color game known as Samurai Shodown 2, and this is not based off the regular Samurai Shodown 2, this is actually based off of Samurai Shodown 64 Warrior's Rage. It's basically a 2D conversion of that game. Still with me? This game though is actually way better than Samurai Shodown 64 Warrior's Rage. And this game is way better than it has any right to be. I didn't expect like anything going into this game, but I walked away very satisfied with it. It is also available on the Switch. It came out in 2020, and so if you want to play this game nowadays, you actually can, and it's actually pretty fun. Obviously, when it comes to the presentation, it's going to look very basic. Yes, it does look very basic, and it looks pretty whatever nowadays, but there's much more to this game than the presentation. It does have the same storyline as Sam Sho 64 Warrior's Rage, with Yuga the Destroyer coming back, but again, it's pretty whatever. See, it's the gameplay where this game actually really shines. It's actually pretty fun, and it's pretty faithful to regular Samurai Shodown. It has a good flow to it, it feels satisfying, and it's got a decent speed. It really does actually feel like a Samurai Shodown game, and it even has a little bit of violence in it too, which is pretty great for such a small handheld console. All the characters from Warrior's Rage return, but there's a few that were added here like Charlotte and Jubei. The game still has the slash and bust modes for each character, and all the moves are pretty much the same from the main game, but it feels a lot nicer. I feel like slash and bust is actually decently implemented here, and I'd want to use bust. It really is a Samurai Shodown game for handhelds, and it's actually good. The game even had this collection mode that was supposed to extend the game's longevity. I didn't really mess around with this though, it's some like virtual cards, but this game, it's actually worth trying. And so here we have the original Samurai Shodown releasing all the way back in 1993. The original Samurai Shodown was really different from like almost every fighting game at the time, and really was an innovator when it came to fighting games, as most fighting games did not have any sort of weapon. Usually they did some kind of hand-to-hand combat. And you know, coming back all these years later, the game actually still does hold up. I think it holds up a lot better than like the original Fatal Fury and even like the original King of Fighters. The game is still pretty stiff nowadays. It isn't as smooth as you'd like it, and the game is a lot slower than even some of the other Samurai Shodown games, but I still, again, think it actually holds up, and I think it actually plays to the game's strength. The fighting is a lot more methodical, and thanks to it being a bit slower and a bit clunkier, you really gotta almost plan out what you're going to do. The game is incredibly punishing even nowadays, and you can totally just get messed up by button mashing. You have a number of fighters in this game. They're all decently different from each other. There's 2 kicks and 2 sword attacks. This game though, it really is not messing around. Like, it is no problem just wiping the floor with you, and you know, playing through the arcade mode, it's gonna kick your ass. There's mad button reads just like the old Fatal Fury games. I mean, it's easier than Fatal Fury, but the game is not anywhere near as easy or smooth as some of the other Sam Sho games. It's still very difficult. The counter system is very cool in this game, and it really does punish like with a ton of extra damage, and it made multiplayer even more fun. The button mashing showdowns are still incredibly difficult, and there's even slow-mo when a ton of damage is done. There's also blood, which wasn't too common in fighting games, especially outside of Mortal Kombat. And I think that the original Sam Sho, it's still a fun little time. It's cool to see where the series got started and how so many things that are iconic to the series really did get started right here in this first game. And honestly, I would argue that maybe no other Sam Sho game has been as punishing as this game was. They knew from day one they wanted to create a pretty difficult, methodical fighter, and I think that's really worth commending. I think it's still worth trying nowadays. And so here we have Samurai Shodown 4, Amakusa's Revenge. The story is about, as the title implies, Amakusa coming back from Sam Sho 3 and exacting his revenge. He has like this big castle and there's a bunch of fighters. Now, I will first say off that the aesthetic again looks very different from the other 3 games, but it still looks very cool and it is incredibly stylized. When it comes to the characters, there's 2 new characters here, while a few of the OGs return like Charlotte. In terms of the fighting itself, the game actually feels pretty decently smooth. It feels much smoother than 3, and the game is nowhere near as difficult as 3. 3 just got insane. This is much more manageable. With that in mind, it's also much more fun, and I had a lot of fun playing through the arcade mode and messing around with my friends. You have bigger health bars here, but you just do a ton of damage to each other, and the game is really just as punishing as it's always been. The game is still fun and slashing up your opponents is still good. The game even has fatalities to it. Yeah, they really have fatalities like in the vein of Mortal Kombat, and these can get pretty brutal. You could slash someone in half. It's like, oh my god, but it's pretty cool. And you know, I gotta say, 4 games in, it's still pretty cool how basically the entire tide of battle can be changed in like a single slash because of how just punishing it can be. And I think it still really provides a unique fighter even all these years later, and I have no problem saying that Sam Sho 4 is actually worth trying. It's still pretty fun. The game was also ported to the Neo Geo Pocket Color as Samurai Shodown ! But it is simply just a port. It is not an original game like that other Neo Geo Pocket game, and that's cool too. But Sam Sho 4, it's a pretty decent time. Alright, and so here we have Samurai Shodown 2 releasing in 1994. So for Sam Sho 2, SNK saw that they kind of had a hit on their hands and really just kind of almost went all out for the second game. And you know, I think it shows because it's still one of the best Samurai Shodown. And I think that it really does pay off. All of these new characters are great. All the old characters are also great. They've all got a bunch of new moves, and some of them feel actually really different. This game was like built from the ground up. It didn't just really reuse all of the first game stuff, and you can tell because it also feels much smoother. Is it as smooth as, say, you know, Samurai Shodown 4 or 5? No, of course it's not, but it is actually more than playable nowadays, more so than even the first game, and I'd say that it's more playable than even the third game. It's very fun still. The way the power meter is used is a little different in this game, and the game even added some more movement options. The game even has a parry. And it doesn't just end there. You can actually break each other's weapons, and then you're just like kind of defenseless. Use like hand to hand, which hella sucks in this game. Like, this game's actually got a bit of depth to it, and that really wasn't seen all that much for the time, especially compared to other fighters where it was like, oh, you know, it's combos and strings and all that. Here it really was all about that methodical strike and, again, breaking weapons and all these movement options. And the parry, I mean, how many fighting games had a parry in 1994? That's a bit crazy to think about. The game is not as hard to play through either. It still is pretty difficult in the arcade mode, and there is some button reading, but it is not as difficult as the first game, and I had some fun with the multiplayer. And all in all, I can still say that the game is fun, and I still genuinely had a good time with it, especially in the multiplayer, and it's actually still worth trying. Alright, and so here's really the fan favorite Samurai Shodown 5. Now, there's been a couple different versions of Samurai Shodown 5 throughout the years. The version that I played and that I am looking at is Samurai Shodown 5 Perfect, which I guess is like an improved version of Special. Now, Samurai Shodown 5, I'll just be real, this game is great. Like, I can easily see why it was the fan favorite. Playing through this game and playing it with some friends was just a fantastic time. This is easily the best of all the old Samurai Shodown games. It really looks at what was great with the old games, and it's just the best version of them all. The game has a really good pace to it. Like, the game actually has some speed to it, much more so than the older Sam Sho games, and I think that it really ups the intensity because you still do a shit ton of damage to each other, and punishing each other just does like tons upon tons of damage, where the entire battle can be low-key decided in like 1 or 2 hits. And so now that everything's moving really fast, oh, it just gets crazy. There's even like a decent amount of combos here that you can like add together, and you can just completely wreck people with them, and I gotta say, it's just an incredibly fun time, and it's very satisfying. This game also just really oozes style. Like, it is not only some fantastic sprites, and the game looks great, but it just has a really nice aesthetic to it, and I really do like how the game looks. And then not only does the game look great, but there's plenty of characters to play as too. This game has just a ton of characters. This is basically like every character from the old games in here. Like, seriously, it has just an absolute ton of characters. And the game has a ton of stages too, and these stages, these are some of the best looking stages you'll find in like a fighting game. Seriously, SNK has just always gotten it so right with their stages, and Capcom could definitely learn something in the stage department because the stages here are great. When it comes to how the fighting feels, every character really just has one style now, even though there is a ton of characters. But the game introduces an overkill mode where you can just completely destroy someone in one hit if you reach the parameters. And I thought out of all the Sam Sho games, all the old ones, this felt the smoothest, this felt the nicest, it was the most satisfying, and again, I had the most fun with it. And the game isn't overly punishing in the arcade mode, but it's certainly punishing in the multiplayer. But hey, I also realize out of all the old Sam Sho games, this really is like the newest, so that's probably a reason why it's the smoothest, but it really just does feel great. Like, I have no problem saying that this is one of the best Sam Sho games and one of the best fighting games from the era. The game is a ton of fun, and there really is a reason why this was the Sam Sho with the most competitive play, it seems, outside of the newest one, and I think that it's still actually really fun to play nowadays, and I have no problem saying, like, if you're looking for a fun Samurai Shodown game or you've never tried the series, this is like the one you really want to play. But then we have Samurai Shodown releasing in 2019, and this is what I believe to be the best of the Samurai Shodown games. For me, it's really not even close. And yeah, it might be a little cheap to say, hey, the best Samurai Shodown is the newest one, but I genuinely think that the best of the Samurai Shodown games is the newest one. I think that the game just really looks at the fundamentals of the original Samurai Shodown and brings them to a modern era with fantastic controls, a wonderful presentation, and a pretty good roster, including its DLC. Sure, it's not the most complex fighter, but I really do think it is the best of the series. Not only does it feel the smoothest by like a landslide, but it's actually just crazy satisfying in really every aspect. I think that this game is really maybe the most punishing Samurai Shodown game since like the original. Like, you can just completely destroy people in like 3 heavy slashes, seriously. Like, the game is incredibly punishing in pretty much every mode. And I'll just be real, I have not played a fighting game that was like as satisfying as this game in quite some time. Like, I did not realize how much fun I was gonna have with it until, you know, I played all of them, and then I played this and I was like, oh, it's not even close. I was like, this game is just so much fun. Like, I've had an absolute blast playing this game with my friends for the last couple of years now, and even the single player content is actually pretty decent. The game is a reboot of the series and just kind of does its own thing with the story, with Gozen, the deceased spirit of a young woman who is possessed and trapped in Yomi, labeled Eternity, in the game itself, and threatens to destroy Japan, so a bunch of warriors show up to try to investigate these evil forces and vanquish them, and you know, story's pretty cool, single player's pretty good, there's a decent amount of content here, but the online really does kick some ass. It's actually pretty fun. I didn't have a ton of lag online, and I think that of course the game's going to excel the best in local multiplayer, but the game is still pretty fun. Story's pretty cool. The single player content, it's not the most robust or diverse, but it's fine enough. There is online multiplayer as well, but I don't really have much experience with that. I've always been a local guy for the fighting games, and you know, the local fighting is pretty good. Like, this game was just a ton of fun in multiplayer, and I have no problem saying that if you're going to play any Samurai Shodown game, you really should just play the newest one. Not only is it the most widely available, not that the old ones aren't also, but it really just is the most satisfying, and I think it honestly really does represent the series the best. Like, I'd be really surprised to find really any aspects where the old ones are better than this new one, outside of maybe the character roster, and I think the roster is pretty good actually in this new one, especially again with the DLC. It's just some of the old ones like Sam Sho 5 and 6 really do have these like crazy rosters, but I think the gameplay really is just better here, and I'd rather have the better gameplay than some extra characters. Regardless, I think we can all agree that the last couple games that have shown up here are pretty good. Samurai Shodown is just an incredibly fun series of fighting games, and it's a shame that it is nowadays decently underrated. It is one of those like cult classics, and it never really broke through to the mainstream, I feel like, especially even in the fighting game scene. I feel like the game never had a ton of longevity when it came to the professional fighting game scene, at least in the mainstream, but hey, I still think it's really fun. I think it's one of SNK's best fighting games, and I, again, have no problem recommending it. And let me know down below what everyone thinks about the Samurai Shodown series. I'd love to know what your favorite is, your favorite character, or your favorite stage, whatever it is. Let me know. Like, share, sub, all that good stuff. I'll see everyone later. Comment bricks if you made it to this part of the video. Bye-bye.